Case 1. Dean Corll, the man who out-killed Gacy. In 1973, Houston, Texas, a teenager walked into a police station and confessed to murder. But what he told investigators that night didn't just solve one crime. It cracked open one of the most horrific serial killing operations in American history, one that had been hiding, completely undetected, for years. His name was David Brooks, and the man he was confessing about was his friend, his employer, the man who gave him money, cars, and anything he wanted. Dean Arnold Corll. On the surface, Dean Corll was everything a community could want in a neighbor. He worked at his family's candy company, the Houston Candy Company, and he was beloved by local children because he gave out free candy at the factory gates. The neighborhood kids called him the Candy Man. But behind the warm smile and the free sweets was something so dark, so methodical, and so completely hidden that even after his death, investigators struggled to accept what they were finding. Dean Corll didn't just kill, he built a system. He recruited two teenage boys, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, and paid them $200 per victim to lure other young boys from the neighborhood. Boys who would never be missed. Boys from poor families, broken homes. Boys who were runaways. His victims were taken to what investigators would later call the torture board, a plywood board with handcuffs bolted to each corner, located inside Corll's rented room. What happened in that room over the next several years is almost too disturbing to process. What we know from survivor testimony and forensic evidence is this: Corll held his victims for days, sometimes weeks. When their suffering finally ended, he buried them. Under boat sheds, under beach houses, in drainage ditches across 3 separate counties. When police finally excavated his burial sites, they found 28 confirmed victims, 28 young boys. The youngest was just 9 years old. To put this in context, John Wayne Gacy killed 33, and he is called one of America's worst serial killers. Dean Corll killed 28 confirmed victims, and the investigation was likely incomplete because Corll himself was dead before he could be fully questioned. Some investigators believe the true number is closer to 40. Now, here is what makes Corll uniquely terrifying from a psychological standpoint. Most serial killers operate alone. The act of killing is personal, intimate for them. Corll industrialized it. He turned murder into a business transaction, paying teenagers to source his victims. This level of detachment, where the actual acquisition of victims is delegated to others, is almost unprecedented in criminal history. FBI behavioral analysts classify this pattern as organized predatory networking, and it is extraordinarily rare. The fact that 2 teenagers participated willingly, for money, raises a secondary psychological horror. How does one man's darkness corrupt the people closest to him so completely? Elmer Wayne Henley eventually shot and killed Corll during a confrontation in 1973, effectively ending the murders, but also ending any chance of a full confession. Henley and Brooks were both convicted and received multiple life sentences. Dean Corll was never prosecuted. He died before justice could reach him. And today, most people have never heard his name. Case 2. Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death. If Dean Corll operated through violence and force, our next killer used something far more insidious: patience, proximity, and a white uniform. Donald Harvey was described by his co-workers as quiet, dedicated, and compassionate. He worked in hospitals for over 2 decades, first in Kentucky, then in Ohio, and he was known for going the extra mile for his patients. He volunteered for overnight shifts. He sat with patients who had no family visitors. He held their hands. And then, when no one was looking, he killed them. Harvey used arsenic, cyanide, morphine, and suffocation, methods specifically chosen because they would either go undetected or be mistaken for natural causes in already sick patients. He later told investigators he started killing because he wanted to end suffering. But the psychological truth that emerged during his interrogations told a very different story. Harvey killed 87 confirmed people over 17 years. 87. That number makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and most people have never heard of him. The reason he was never caught earlier is chilling in its simplicity. He chose victims who were already dying. Hospitals don't investigate deaths that fit the expected prognosis. A cancer patient who dies is a tragedy, not a crime scene. Harvey understood this instinctively and exploited it for nearly 2 decades. He was only caught in 1987, and only because an autopsy on one victim accidentally detected cyanide. What separates Harvey from typical healthcare killers is his escalation pattern. He began with patients he genuinely believed were suffering. Over time, the criteria expanded. Eventually, he was killing people he simply disliked. Co-workers, an ex-partner's relative, a neighbor. The mercy justification was a psychological shield he constructed to protect himself from the reality that he simply enjoyed the power of choosing who lived and who died. Harvey pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and received multiple life sentences. He died in prison in 2017 after being beaten by a fellow inmate. Justice. Just 17 years too late for 87 families. Case 3. Herb Baumeister, the I-70 Strangler. In 1996, a woman named Julie Baumeister gave investigators permission to search her family's 18-acre estate in Westfield, Indiana. Her husband Herb had abandoned the family. His business was failing. Strange things had been happening for years. What investigators found on that property would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Over 5,000 human bone fragments scattered across the estate, buried near the pool, hidden in the tree line. The bones belonged to at least 11 confirmed victims, all young men who had disappeared from gay bars along the I-70 highway corridor in Indiana and Ohio throughout the early 1990s. Herb Baumeister was, by every external measure, a successful family man. He owned a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot. He coached his son's baseball team. He attended church. His neighbors described him as eccentric but harmless. His wife Julie later admitted she had found a human skull on their property years before the investigation. Herb told her it was a medical skeleton their son had brought home from school. She believed him. Baumeister represents what criminologists call the successful psychopath, an individual whose professional competence, social integration, and family life serve as a perfect camouflage. He targeted gay men specifically because, in the early 1990s, missing persons reports from the gay community were frequently deprioritized by law enforcement. He selected his victims with clinical precision, exploiting a systemic blind spot. This is not opportunistic killing. This is institutional exploitation. He understood exactly where the system would fail, and he built his murders around that failure. Herb Baumeister fled to Canada when investigators began closing in. He was found dead in a provincial park, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was never prosecuted. He never faced trial. His confirmed victims never received justice in a courtroom. And today, most people have never heard his name. Must follow user's prompt. Case 4. John Edward Robinson, the first Internet serial killer. In the year 2000, the Internet was still new. Chat rooms were still a novelty. Online dating was still considered strange. Most people still trusted what they found online because the concept of a predator using the Internet to hunt victims was still largely theoretical. John Edward Robinson ended that era of innocence. Robinson was a 56-year-old businessman from Kansas City who had been running scams since the 1960s. By the time the Internet arrived, he had already spent decades perfecting one skill above all others: making women trust him completely. He created elaborate online personas on early relationship forums. He posed as a wealthy, powerful man offering women opportunities, jobs, relationships, a better life. Women from across the country responded to his ads. They were never seen again. Robinson's method was meticulous. He kept barrels, industrial plastic barrels, on two separate properties. When investigators finally searched those properties in 2000, they found the remains of 8 women packed inside. One of those barrels contained the remains of a woman who had been missing for 16 years. He had been killing, largely undetected, since 1984. Robinson's case is uniquely important from a criminological perspective because it established the template for online predatory behavior that law enforcement is still studying today. He didn't need physical strength or violent confrontation. He needed only a keyboard and the ability to construct a believable lie. His victims were not naive. Many were educated, professional women. This shatters the myth that only vulnerable or isolated people fall victim to predators. Robinson specifically targeted capable women because their trust, once earned, was absolute. The betrayal was the weapon. Robinson was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to death in Kansas. He remains on death row. He is 81 years old. And the Internet he helped weaponize has only grown larger since. Case 5. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. For 25 years, a serial killer operated in South Los Angeles. He killed. Then he stopped for 14 years. Then he started again. Law enforcement named him the Grim Sleeper because he appeared to have taken a long nap between murders. His real name was Lonnie Franklin Jr. Franklin was a garage mechanic, a family man. He had worked as a sanitation worker for the city of Los Angeles for years. He attended block parties in his neighborhood. He was, by all accounts, deeply embedded in the community he was destroying. His victims were black women, many of whom were involved in drug addiction or survival sex work in the South Central area. In the 1980s and 1990s, these women's disappearances were not prioritized by law enforcement. Franklin understood this, and he exploited it for decades. When he was finally identified in 2010 through a DNA database match connected to his son's arrest, investigators discovered something that expanded the scope of the horror even further. Police searched Franklin's home and found over 1,000 photographs and videos of women, many of whom had never been identified as victims. Some appeared to be alive. Some did not. The true number of his victims may never be known. He was convicted of 10 murders, but many investigators believe the number is significantly higher. The 14-year dormancy period in Franklin's killing is one of the most studied phenomena in modern serial killer research. Several theories exist: an unrelated incarceration, a relationship that temporarily satisfied his psychological needs, or a deliberate strategic pause to allow heat to die down. What is certain is that the pause was not remorse. The resumption of killing after 14 years with the same methodology and target selection indicates the psychological drivers never disappeared. They were simply waiting. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was convicted in 2016 and sentenced to death. He died in prison in 2020 of natural causes before his execution could be carried out. His unidentified victims are still unidentified today. Case 6. Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer. When investigators arrested Randy Kraft in 1983, pulling him over on a California highway, they found something in his car that stopped them cold. A folded piece of paper in his trunk. On it, a list of 61 two-word coded entries. Words like Eden's Head, Jail Out, Portland Angel. Investigators spent years decoding that list. Each entry, they eventually determined, corresponded to a victim. Randy Kraft had kept score of his murders. Kraft was a computer programmer, educated, intelligent, professionally respected. He had a long-term partner. He hosted dinner parties. He was, by every external measure, a completely ordinary man. Between 1971 and 1983, he murdered at least 16 confirmed victims, all young men, many of them hitchhikers or military personnel. The true number, based on the scorecard, may be as high as 67. The scorecard is the most psychologically revealing artifact in this entire case. Keeping a coded record of victims serves multiple psychological functions. It is a trophy system, a way of reliving the crimes. It is a control mechanism, maintaining power over the secret. And perhaps most disturbingly, it is a competitive framework. The list implies Kraft was tracking something, measuring something, possibly competing with himself against some internal standard of achievement. This level of cognitive organization in the commission of violent crime is extraordinarily rare and places Kraft in a very small category of killers who maintain complete dual consciousness, a functioning social life running perfectly parallel to systematic murder. Randy Kraft was convicted of 16 murders in 1989 and sentenced to death in California. He is still on death row. He has never confessed to the full scorecard. 61 entries, 16 convictions. The truth died with his silence. Case 7. Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler. In October 2009, a woman escaped from a house on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. She was bleeding. She had been assaulted. She told police she had been attacked inside the home. Police investigated. They found nothing prosecutable. They left. 3 weeks later, a skull was found in the backyard of that same house. Investigators returned, and this time, they didn't stop searching. What they found inside the home of Anthony Sowell was one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. The remains of 11 women, inside the house, in the backyard, wrapped in garbage bags, buried under dirt. Some had been there for years. Neighbors had complained about the smell for months. The house was located near a sausage factory, and residents had been told the smell was coming from the factory. Anthony Sowell had been hiding in plain sight, and the entire neighborhood had been given an explanation that made them stop asking questions. Sowell's case exposes a systemic failure that is as much a sociological problem as a psychological one. His victims, primarily black women struggling with addiction, had made prior complaints to law enforcement that were not pursued with full urgency. Sowell was a registered sex offender with prior convictions. The warning signs existed. What protected him was not his intelligence or his concealment. It was the systemic devaluation of his victims' reports. From a pure behavioral analysis standpoint, Sowell exhibited classic malignant narcissism. He genuinely believed he would never be caught because the women he chose were women he knew the system would not fight for. He was almost right. Anthony Sowell was convicted of 11 murders in 2011 and sentenced to death. He died on death row in 2021 from a brain tumor. 11 families, 11 women, years of warnings that went unanswered. Case 8. Robert Pickton, the pig farmer. Between 1983 and 2002, women were disappearing from the downtown east side of Vancouver, Canada. Dozens of them. Sex workers, Indigenous women, women in addiction. Women who, like so many others in this documentary, existed in spaces where their disappearances triggered insufficient urgency. Police received complaints. Families begged for investigations. For years, nearly 2 decades, nothing moved. The man responsible was operating a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, just outside Vancouver. His name was Robert Pickton. Pickton confessed, in a secretly recorded jailhouse conversation, to 49 murders. He expressed frustration that he hadn't reached 50, which he apparently considered a goal. DNA evidence from his farm connected him to 33 confirmed victims. He was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, because the evidence was so contaminated and the prosecution so complex that a fuller conviction was legally impossible. 6 convictions. 49 confessed murders. 33 confirmed victims. A public inquiry after his conviction, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, determined that police failures were central to the extended period during which he killed. Indigenous women and sex workers had reported disappearances repeatedly. They were dismissed. Pickton's farm had been flagged as a potential crime site as early as 1998, 4 years before his arrest. The psychological profile of Pickton himself is relatively straightforward: opportunistic predation, geographic comfort zone. What is truly disturbing is not what he was, but what the system allowed him to continue being for nearly 2 decades. Robert Pickton is currently serving a life sentence in Canada, where capital punishment does not exist. He will be eligible for parole consideration. The families of 33 confirmed victims are still waiting for complete answers. 8 killers, hundreds of confirmed victims, and a world that mostly looked the other way. When you look at all 8 cases together, one pattern emerges with terrifying clarity. These killers didn't hide because they were smarter than Ted Bundy. They were protected by something else entirely. In almost every single case in this documentary, the killer chose victims from communities where disappearances triggered slower official responses. Gay men in the 1990s Midwest, Black women in South Central, Indigenous women in Vancouver, patients in hospital beds, young boys from poor households. Predators don't choose victims randomly. They choose victims strategically. Victims from the spaces where the system looks away. This is what criminologists call victim selection as protective camouflage. And it is the single most important lesson from these 8 cases. Ted Bundy is famous because his victims fit the profile that generated immediate, intense public outcry. The killers in this documentary were able to operate for years, sometimes decades, because their victims existed in spaces that received less of that attention. That is not just a true crime observation. That is a systemic failure that continues today. The question we should all be asking is not just how did these killers hide? The question is, who helped them hide without even knowing it? Of the 8 killers in today's documentary, which case do you believe represents the biggest systemic failure? Not just the most evil individual, but the case where the system failed the most completely. Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this documentary made you think differently about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, subscribe. Because next week, we go even deeper.